Take a pit stop for all things NASCAR with the Four Tire Change podcast. Here is your host, Dawson Iserloh.
It's the Four Tire Change podcast, back with yet another episode. The Atlanta race has come and gone. Christopher Bell is your winner. We'll talk about everything that happened, get into next week's race as well here as things roll on Four Tire Change. Excited to get into it. You know, this was a race too. Atlanta right now might be one of the best tracks on the circuit entertainment-wise. I think we've known that. The reconfiguration, turning it into a modified kind of version of a drafting track, it's worked out better than anybody could have ever imagined. And I think we saw that again. The comers and goers, the ability to move around the racetrack, use different grooves, all the lead changes. It led for some really good stuff. And you kind of take some of the action-packed things that Daytona and Talladega bring, and you take away a lot of the stuff like the fuel mileage. And so I think all that ends up being productive. We'll see if Daytona and Talladega can figure out some of those issues. But this was an exciting race. Before we talk about the race, we have to get into the fact that after last week's podcast drop, Chase Briscoe was docked an exorbitant number of points because of modifications to the spoiler in what was a pole run at the Daytona 500. He is now sitting at negative, or he was sitting at negative 67 points through one race. It's crazy, man. And Briscoe's had a couple of these instances, and I don't know if he had any fault in any of them. But now you put a team like him who's trying to build new chemistry with a new team, a new car over at Joe Gibbs Racing. Knew everything for him. Trying to build that chemistry. And look, he was given a big opportunity to drive the 19 car. And now he's got to feel like he's fighting uphill all season. Look, if they win a race or two, then all of a sudden that all goes away. But it's brutal. And to cap it all off, if he makes the playoffs and doesn't have, 2 or more wins, he'd have negative playoff points to start that portion of the season. It's brutal. It is a brutal run for him, and as far as we know, it's just an oversight or a mistake on Joe Gibbs Racing's part. So that was one of the storylines of the week. As we got to Atlanta, it was all about the Fords in qualifying. 10 of the front 11 starting grid spots, including Ryan Blaney winning the pole. We knew the Fords would be strong. We didn't know they'd be that strong in qualifying, but they really brought their stuff. And as this race starts to play out, the first stage, I think, was all about the Fords. They continue to control things. You saw a great run from Todd Gilliland up there, who's later going to end up having an issue that kind of sets his day back. Didn't eliminate him. He battled his way back on the lead lap, but couldn't really get back up into the track position portion that he had before. Blaney, Cindric, Logano, all the classic guys you would expect to see at the front with the Fords were all making moves, and they were all enjoying a fairly dominant first stage. When all things come to the end there, I think the interesting thing about the first couple stages and the way this thing worked out is it was such a track position-based race, but then all of a sudden after that second stage with some of the strategy differences, you kind of flipped the field. That changed this race completely, and it never really fully went back. A lot of the Fords who had taken a lot of stage points early on had to get flipped to the back of the field because of the way the track position worked out. And now, as we set up the final stage here, you've got a lot of different drivers up front. And shout out to Kyle Larson, who won the second stage. We've talked about all the problems he's had on the drafting style tracks. He was up and around the front all day long. So that was a really big development for the number 5 team. Interesting thing, too, we see at Daytona, it really has a feeling of randomness, right? Whoever's going to be at the front, it just is a matter of which lines you get in and all that stuff. Atlanta, with the handling that it brings in, it felt like it was still a lot of the really faster cars that were up there. You didn't have as many Cinderella stories riding up towards the front, especially in the end. A couple different incidents down the stretch there. Blaney, of course, gets wrapped up in one. You saw Ty Gibbs get involved as well. Stenhouse makes a move there that's super aggressive, and Stenhouse has been known to do things like that. That caused some problems. I think it was a classic case of a lot of drivers feeling some control here, where at Daytona they kind of relying on the runs of the lane that they're in, and there's maybe this kind of handcuff feeling where you can't make a ton of moves. Atlanta, those moves were there to be made, so I think that ended up getting a few drivers kind of over antsy and over anxious before it was really time to go. So you saw some of those cautions start to pile up. But in the very end here, it turns into a duel. And I got to say this, I'm not a huge, the way Carson Hocevar has been handling these things, kind of this reckless abandon that he's driving with, I'm not the biggest fan of it. And yet, I can't sit there and deny that some of the moves he was making in the last 5 laps of this race were incredible. And so as it starts to set up and you're thinking whether or not it's going to be Bell up front, you've also got Larson in the mix. And then here comes the 77, and he makes that move to force it 3 wide. And it was tremendous. And then unfortunately, after all of that, Josh Berry, who had a great run for the 21, I should have mentioned him in the first stage, as one of those cars who was up there early and often. Josh Berry was tremendous in the Wood Brothers racing car. Wreck happens behind the leaders, and what did we see? We saw last week at Daytona. They let the leaders race to the line when the wreck happened behind them. We saw in the Xfinity race, they let the leaders race to the line, and the trucks had a situation somewhat similar as well. But here, when it came down to the Cup Series race, you have a wreck behind them, and they call it caution. The camera angle we had on the broadcast, we didn't even know what happened, right? All of a sudden, they're racing it out. Here we go, 3 wide finish, going to be tremendous like last year. No, caution flag. I think it's probably the right decision. I think they probably went a little bit overboard in letting things play out the last couple times. Daytona was real specific, I guess, with what they felt like was okay. This time you had cars kind of going down the track and potentially coming back up, and so they ultimately stopped this thing. It's just a little disappointing for the inconsistency's sake. I think safety has to be the number one priority always, so I don't want to be critical of their decision. But it's also tough. We were robbed of potentially a great finish. But with that being said, Christopher Bell's the one who's out in front. A big win for the number 20 team. Look, this would have been a season-changing, program-changing win for the 77. He doesn't get it. The 20 does. And this could be the start of another really, really good season. You know, I think C-Bell has established himself as one of the top 5 drivers in the sport right now. He's somebody who preseason, last year I thought he had a chance to win the championship. I still think he's got a chance to do it this year. And he's in the right spot there at the end, makes a couple moves. I wish we could have seen it play out. I don't know. I feel like the 77 had all the momentum coming down to that back stretch, and it felt like maybe he was going to pull ahead and win this thing. But ultimately, it ends up being the 20 car that pulls ahead, and they get the big-time win. So they get the 5 playoff points as well. The 20 joins in with the 24 as the 2 winners this season. And I think we had another really exciting Atlanta race. And, look, I hope the racing stays that way at Atlanta. I don't necessarily need other tracks to jump in on this action as well that we've kind of seen suggested, but it was really, really good. Next week's interesting, and this whole first stretch of racing is interesting because what have you seen with 2 drafting style tracks? The standings can be a little misleading, right? We don't necessarily know what that speed's going to look like when we get to our traditional mile and a half, and there will be a stretch later this month, or I guess I should say early next month when we flip the calendar to March, where you're going to start to see some of those tracks where we ultimately know you have to go with a really fast hot rod to the racetrack to have a chance. This week's not necessarily one of those either that's going to be an indicator of future speed because we're going to COTA. So you're going to have 2 drafting tracks and a road course. Somebody like SVG benefits tremendously from this. I think SVG is going to win a race this year, and this is his first big chance. It's also a new course. We have the shorter track at COTA, which is not new to COTA, but it's new to NASCAR. I'm interested to see how some of those differences are going to play out. We should get to see a little bit, practice time, qualifying time, whatever it may be. I'm excited for this thing, and I think the contenders at COTA are going to be, it's important to note, remember, we have a lot of road courses right now on this schedule. These drivers could be, there's a lot of points to be gained just in the road course races by themselves. So if you're a driver that consistently struggles with these tracks, you're going to be in for some trouble down the stretch, right? You're going to have a few more races like this that you have to get through, so you try and find a way to get as many points as possible. The last thing I wanted to mention about Atlanta, as we since SVG came up, I was really impressed with him yesterday. I thought he really managed his race well. I know he ends up getting caught up in a couple of different little situations where he falls back a little bit, but I thought he really handled the race car well. Kyle Busch was also there. He and Josh Berry, I had them written down as guys who were just there all day long. And as, is the case in these types of racetracks, Berry gets caught up in something in the last lap. Busch gets caught in a couple different little skirmishes here and there, and it ends up not getting necessarily the finish they wanted, although Kyle did end up finding his way to the front. But it will be fascinating for me as SVG continues to get more data and learn how to handle these tracks. We know he's going to be fast in that 88 car. So, of course, I think he's got to be the favorite, and I will go ahead and pick him for COTA. Why not? I think SVG is the best road course racer in the sport, and we've seen that before. It is going to be a little different winning a race when people are expecting him to win one, And when he's racing for points and he's feeling the pressure of a playoff spot on the line, I think at Chicago he kind of caught some people off guard, and we know the situation that was with all the rain and everything like that. But why not pick the guy who I think is the best road course racer in the sport? Of course, eyes will be on Christopher Bell, Kyle Larson, Chase Elliott, certainly. Michael McDowell's been great at these tracks in recent memory. Chase Briscoe's had a lot of good runs. And you can't forget about somebody like Daniel Suarez. But I am going to go, ultimately, with the guy who I think is unbeatable right now. As close to unbeatable. I shouldn't say unbeatable, because we know one small mistake and this could all be over. But I'll take SVG. And we'll do it after next week. We'll take a look at where the standings are at, because it's going to be really interesting. I think 3 races where you go, hey, this is 3 races, but it's also none of our traditional mile and a halves. That's going to have some names up at the top that we're maybe not expecting, and it's definitely going to have some names sitting there near the bottom that we weren't expecting. Definitely Chase Briscoe, who hopefully, for his sake, can get out of the negative point situation by that week. We'll see if he gets there or not. That'll do it for this week's episode of 4 Tire Change. Please continue to like, comment, subscribe. Appreciate the support we've been getting here so far in Season 2. And we're going to keep things rolling. COTA this week. We'll have the recap for you next time.